Welcome. I'm Joan Youngman, a senior fellow here at the Lincoln Institute, and we're delighted to have you with us today to hear an outstanding scholar, a very creative thinker, and a great friend of the Lincoln Institute, Professor Steven Sheffrin of Tulane University. Steve is just one of these incredibly smart people who's interested in everything, and he's made time today to share with us insights from his new book, which is published by Cambridge University Press, Tax Fairness and Folk Justice. So please join me in welcoming him back to Lincoln.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is, I'll be talking today about the project I've been involved with. And actually the project got started when I did a paper for a Lincoln conference. And I was asked by Joan and the other organizer to think about why people don't like market value taxation for property tax. And as I thought about that, it led me into some psychology issues, and eventually this expanded into a full manuscript. And so the focus today is on people's everyday attitudes toward justice, what I call folk justice, and how that differs from what I'll call expert justice. So we can start off by talking about some puzzles that we experience. There's lots of puzzles with taxation, but some puzzles that we experience from time to time. First of all, Americans really do not like the estate and gift tax. We've recently increased the exemption, and yet this is a tax targeted to the very wealthy. So we limited that, but at the same time we expanded subsidies to low-wage workers through the Earned Income Tax Credit. So on the one hand, we don't want to do redistributive taxation, but on the other hand, we're very generous with respect to certain types of subsidies to the poor. You can't pick up a newspaper these days without having someone talk about how terrible inequality is in the U.S. But when you talk to people individually and you just read commentary, they routinely embrace the astronomical salaries paid to sports stars and entertainers. I'm not sure how this shows up. This is Michael Spitz swimming in a sea of dollar bills here. But when Derek Jeter renegotiated his contract recently, the attitude of the Yankees fans, well, you know, he earned it, it's his money. That was the view that they took. But at the same time, you hear this people bemoaning the fact there's so much inequality in America. People hate the property tax, we know that, yet they only revolt against it during certain periods of economic change. Some groups of taxpayers are much more obedient in terms to the tax authorities than others, but even when they face the same tax regime, the same enforcement regime. And everybody, more or less everybody, at least thinks about chiseling on their taxes a little bit, but all of a sudden certain non-compliers, like Leona Helmsley, suddenly become social pariahs. So these are some of the puzzles that we think about. And my starting point for answering these puzzles, or addressing these puzzles, is that we really should distinguish two types of views on taxation. There's kind of the expert views of taxation, and they focus, and those are promoted by economists, philosophers, legal theorists. And the focus of those individuals is largely distributional. You know, who gets what? Who's getting what share of income? I call that everyday Rawlsianism. John Rawls is a very profound, had a very profound fact, a philosopher down the road at Harvard. His book about, you know, only designing social policies to raise the welfare of the least well-off in society really kind of is reflectively become, if you will, the expert view of what redistribution should be. I contrast that with everyday notions of what I call folk justice, or ordinary people's ideas of justice. And they differ in a couple different important ways. One, they have a psychological foundation, which I'll discuss in a minute or two. And second, the focus is not so much on who gets what, but it's on procedure and process. It's about whether people are being treated fairly or not. Now, if you think about how actual tax policies are formed, they're formed in a very political environment where public passions rage, where individuals, the representatives, all debate ideas about fairness. I think it's important to be sensitive to both these ideas, both the ideas of the experts who are trying to push tax policy in certain directions, but also the ideas of individuals, the so-called folk justice, and how they affect tax policy. So there's a number of, if you think about these two types of of ideas about justice, the experts and ordinary people, there's a number of questions that arise. First of all, well, how should they interact? How should we reconcile the ideas of experts with ordinary people? One approach comes from Rawls and from a long tradition of philosophy, where the idea is the philosopher sees what the ordinary opinions are out there, tries to educate the public, if you will, and then reaches a situation where the public, if they saw things correctly, would understand the views of the experts, and with some back and forth, maybe some give and take. Rawls called that a reflective equilibrium, and we'll look about that a little bit later. The question is how deep and what exactly are the ideas of the public here? Another possibility, again from two Harvard professors down the road, Steve Sheffrin and Louis Kapleau, they suggest that in general we should worry more about people's welfare and not about abstract ideas of fairness, because abstract ideas of fairness may conflict with policies that will improve welfare. But at the same time, if people care deeply about fairness, maybe we should incorporate that into our views as well. Another issue, an important issue, is well, what are the primary psychological foundations of folk justice? Are these ideas just transitory, or are they kind of deeply rooted in human nature and human psychology? And furthermore, do they have important explanatory power for different areas of taxation? And perhaps do they provide us with clues to how we could reform taxation and make everyone better off? So those are the questions that naturally emerge when you think about the difference between everyday justice of ordinary people and the experts. So I'm going to talk now about what I consider the 5 psychological foundations of folk justice. And each of these has its own well-established empirical basis. The first 3 I'll talk about are very well established in the psychology and economics literature. The last 2 are less well known, but I think are equally important and have some explanatory power as we go forward. The first idea that ordinary people hold is the notion of procedural justice. There's been a long body of literature, which originally started in law, which emphasizes that people really value fair process and fair procedure. So even someone who's lost a lawsuit, if they had a trial, they feel better about it. People who are fired and they do exit interviews, just the fact that they do exit interviews and let them hear their views actually makes a difference. People are more satisfied when they get a chance to participate in the process. So there's 2 aspects of procedural justice. One is the process itself perceived as fair, and are people treated respectively? And the second idea is, do you have an opportunity to express an opinion or express your voice in the process? And as I mentioned, there's a large body of empirical research shows that people will actually accept worse outcomes to them personally if they feel they've been treated fairly in the process. The second major idea, and this again goes back to the 1950s along with procedural justice, is this notion of equity and kind of social exchange theory. People strongly believe that there should be a relationship between the inputs they put into a process and the outputs they get out. So I'll give you an example. There's a famous psychology study where psychologists advertise for people to do some kind of some work which wasn't particularly meaningful. And there was a wage being specified. And so some people came in, they volunteered for it, and then it was like, say, $5 an hour. And some people were paid $5 an hour. Other people were told, well, we made a mistake. The work isn't really worth $5 an hour, but it's only worth $4 an hour, but since we advertise, we'll pay you the $5 an hour. And other people were told, well, sorry, it was only worth $4 an hour. We only can pay you $4 an hour. Now, you would expect that people who were paid less than advertised would not be very happy. But it turns out the people who were, in fact, told that the work was worth more, but we're going to pay you anyway because there's a mistake, actually weren't very happy either, because they didn't feel that their inputs were being measured corresponding with their outputs. And when that happens, when people, for example, feel that they're underpaid for a certain job or overpaid for a certain job, they'll typically adjust their behavior accordingly. If they feel they're overpaid for a certain job, they'll all of a sudden later say, well, the job was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. It was a lot more complicated. And so they adjust their attitudes and so forth. So there's a very strong connection in everyday life between what we put in and what we get out. And that'll come back particularly with regard to talking about income and taxation. Most of you are familiar these days with some of the experiments where someone's giving, in a laboratory, someone's given like $10 and there's a competitor across the table, and they're saying, well, you can keep the $10, you can give some of that $10 to the person across the table. Now, and you'll only see them once. Now, in that situation, the so-called rational economic individual would simply keep all the money themselves and not give any to anyone else. But in fact, people routinely give 20, 30% of that $10 over to the other person.